The dining room glowed with candlelight that Thanksgiving evening, the table crowded with roasted turkey, bowls of cranberry sauce, and the sweet scent of pumpkin pie wafting through the air. Laughter mingled with the clink of silverware as relatives leaned close to share stories. I'd spent 2 days preparing this meal, basting, stirring, polishing every dish so that my family could gather in warmth. For a while, it worked. Plates passed, glasses refilled, children giggled at the end of the table. I watched my daughter, proud of the woman she'd become, and thought, even through the tensions of the past year, perhaps tonight we'd bridge the distance. Then her voice cut across the table, sharp as a knife against china. "Before we finish," she said, standing, glass in hand, "I need to say something." "Mom, this'll be your last Thanksgiving here. You're not invited back." The words fell heavy, louder than the hum of conversation, louder even than the wind rattling the window panes. Forks froze mid-air. My son-in-law shifted uncomfortably. The children looked from face to face, confused. I sat stunned, the room tilting as though the floor had dropped beneath me. Not invited back? In my own home? The very house where I had scraped together every dollar, where I'd hammered nails, painted walls, where my husband and I once dreamed of building holidays for our children. The turkey on my plate turned to ash in my mouth. I heard a cousin cough, a chair squeak, but no one spoke. My daughter's eyes were firm, her smile polite, as though this decision had been rehearsed. I lowered my gaze to my hands, still flecked with flour from rolling pie crusts that morning. They trembled, not with age, but with betrayal. I wanted to shout, to remind them whose name was carved into this house's history. Instead, I folded my napkin carefully, pressing it flat against my lap. The clock in the hallway chimed 8 p.m., marking the moment like a verdict. My heart pounded in my ears as her words echoed again, not invited back. But even as humiliation seared through me, another truth stirred quietly beneath it. Because while she believed she held the power, only one name was written on the deed to this house. Mine. I didn't speak then. But in my silence, something shifted. The morning after that dinner, the house felt quieter than it had in years. The smell of roasted turkey still lingered faintly in the air, mixed with the sharper tang of extinguished candles. Empty glasses and crumpled napkins cluttered the table, silent reminders of words that could not be unsaid. I moved slowly, rinsing dishes under hot water, the steam fogging my glasses. Each plate I stacked felt heavier than china should. This house had been my anchor for nearly 3 decades. When my husband passed, it became the only constant I could hold on to. I worked 2 jobs, typing medical records by day, cleaning offices by night. Every paycheck, every overtime hour went into saving for this home. I patched the roof myself one summer, climbed ladders when my knees already ached, and painted the shutters the deep blue my husband had always loved. It wasn't luxury. It was survival made solid. A place where I thought my children would always feel safe. Even now, I sometimes touch my bare finger, still expecting to feel that ring. My daughter had once understood. I still remember her teenage years when she'd sit with me on the porch, books in her lap, and whisper dreams about the future. Back then, she'd say, "This house feels like forever." But forever had shifted. Somewhere between her career, her marriage, and the rush of modern life, her tone changed. Small comments became daggers disguised as jokes. "Mom, maybe you should downsize. This place is too much for you." Or, "We'll take care of it one day." Don't stress red flags I folded neatly away, pretending they weren't signals. My flaw had always been that, minimizing, smoothing the rough edges, telling myself family harmony was worth silence. Still, neighbors noticed. Mrs. Campbell from across the street once stopped me while I was trimming hedges. "Your daughter talks as if this is her house already," she whispered, glancing nervously toward my porch. "Don't let her push you out, dear." I laughed it off then, brushing dirt from my gloves. She doesn't mean it that way. But the truth was harder to ignore with each holiday. At last year's Christmas, she made a comment in front of relatives. Mom really shouldn't be lifting heavy things anymore. Maybe we should just take over the place. Everyone chuckled politely, and I forced a smile, hiding the sting behind a sip of cider. This Thanksgiving had only made public what she had already been planting quietly for years. My son-in-law, Brian, played his part too, subtle but steady. He always offered to handle the bills, to talk with the bank. Once he waved a brochure for a mortgage refinance under my nose, saying, "Wouldn't it be easier if we co-signed?" His smile was smooth, but his eyes were calculating. I had brushed that aside too, choosing peace. Now peace felt like betrayal of myself. As I cleared the last of the dishes that morning, my granddaughter, Lily, padded in, her small feet soft against the hardwood floor. She tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma, Mommy says you won't be here next year." "Is that true?" My throat tightened. I crouched, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Sweetheart, I'll always be somewhere. You can find me." Remember that her innocent eyes reflected a confusion that mirrored my own heartbreak. I watched her skip out of the kitchen, her laughter trailing up the stairs, and I realized this wasn't only about me. It was about what kind of legacy she would grow up witnessing. Would she learn that love could be dismissed, that loyalty could be erased with a sentence at the dinner table? Or would she see that dignity has roots deeper than entitlement? The clock in the hall ticked steadily. Outside, the maple tree bent in the November wind, its branches tapping the glass like a warning. I stood straighter, the dish towel clenched in my hand. If my daughter believed I had no place here, then she had forgotten the truth. This house was mine, and soon enough, she would be reminded. The following week, the rhythm of the house seemed almost normal again, but underneath every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every closing of a door, I felt the tension like a pulse. My daughter came by in the evenings, carrying grocery bags and smiling too brightly. "Thought I'd help you stock up," she said, setting items on the counter. Her voice carried the same forced cheer as someone trying to distract a child from a wound. But late one night, as I carried laundry upstairs, I heard her on the phone. The walls of this house had always been thin. "She doesn't even realize," she whispered sharply. "Once the papers are handled, she won't have to come back." "It'll finally be ours," I stopped mid-step, the basket pressing against my hip. "Papers?" My breath caught. The next morning, I asked casually over coffee, "Were you on the phone late last night?" She blinked quickly, then smiled. "Oh, just catching up with a friend." "Mom, you really worry too much. Brian always said it was about security, about protecting the family. But security, I realized, sounded a lot like control, gaslighting, smooth and dismissive. Still, the words gnawed at me. That afternoon, I checked the study where Brian kept his briefcase. The air smelled faintly of leather polish and ink. On the desk lay an open folder with a draft document, projections for property taxes typed neatly with Brian's name scribbled in the margins. My hand trembled as I traced the paper. A floorboard groaned behind me. I spun, heart hammering. Brian stood at the door. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice calm but tight. I forced a smile. The paper already slid halfway back into the folder. "Just making sure the kids didn't leave crayons up here." He chuckled dryly. "Always suspicious. You know we're just trying to help, right?" His eyes lingered on me a moment too long before he left, the air colder in his absence. That night, sleep refused to come. I replayed every moment, his smirk, my daughter's whispers, the word ours, echoing like a drumbeat. The following day, my granddaughter Lily sat at the table coloring with a red crayon. She looked up innocently. "Mommy says soon you won't live here anymore, Grandma." "But I can still visit, right?" The crayon snapped in her hand as she said it, the wax breaking sharply against the page. My chest tightened. Even the children were absorbing the script. I reached across, smoothing her hair. "Sweetheart, You'll always have a place with me, I said softly, though my voice shook. When she ran off to play, I stayed seated, staring at the broken crayon on the table. It felt like a sign. Fragile trust, splintered with one careless sentence. I walked into the hallway, my eyes drawn to the cabinet where the deed rested in its envelope. My name, not theirs. My sacrifice, not theirs. For the first time, I understood that silence might no longer protect me. But it could be the weapon I used to protect what was mine. The December days grew shorter, shadows stretching across the living room by mid-afternoon. I lit a fire in the hearth, its crackle filling the silence, but unease lingered with the smoke. Whispers of papers haunted me. If my daughter and Brian were plotting, I needed more than suspicions. I needed proof. The first piece came unexpectedly. While sorting through the mail one morning, I found an envelope addressed to Brian from a law office across town. Curiosity burned as I slid it open. Inside was a glossy pamphlet, Estate Planning, Transitioning Property the Easy Way. My pulse quickened. Scrawled in pen at the bottom margin was a note in Brian's handwriting, "Discuss with Sarah after holidays." I tucked the pamphlet back carefully, heart pounding, but the words seared into my memory. The second piece arrived at the bank. I had stopped in to withdraw cash for Christmas gifts, and Mr. Hughes, who had managed my accounts for years, waved me into his office. The air smelled of peppermint candies and old leather, familiar and grounding. "Your daughter and son-in-law stopped by last week," he said, adjusting his glasses. "They asked how property titles might be transferred." Of course, I told them only the deed holder has that authority, but I thought you should know I gripped the arms of the chair, the leather creaking under me. "So they're planning already?" He nodded gravely. "Be cautious." The third piece nearly cost me. A few days later, I was tidying the study when I noticed Brian's laptop open, screen aglow. My better judgment urged me to leave it, but fear overruled. I leaned in, scanning quickly. An email draft sat unsent. "Once the deed is adjusted, we'll host every holiday here without interruption. She won't be in the way anymore." The words blurred as anger rose hot in my chest. I reached for my phone, snapping a photo, but my hand brushed against a glass of water, tipping it across the desk. The hiss of electronics filled the room. Panicked, I snatched a towel, blotting furiously, heart hammering. Footsteps echoed in the hall. My daughter's voice called, "Everything okay?" "Yes," I shouted too quickly. "Just spilled some water." Her footsteps slowed, then retreated. I sagged against the desk, chest heaving, as the laptop flickered but revived. I captured the photo quickly before closing it. My hand shook as if I'd just committed a crime. That night, I spread the evidence across my mind like cards. Mail pamphlet about estate transfers, Brian's note in the margin, banker's confirmation of their inquiry, draft email planning to remove me from holidays, 3 links forming a chain no denial could break. Yet instead of triumph, grief washed over me. I remembered the night my husband and I signed the original deed, his hand firm on mine, the notary stamping the page with a seal that felt like forever. I remembered painting Lily's nursery upstairs, humming to myself with sore feet but a happy heart. All that sacrifice now reduced to whispers about papers and plots to erase me. I could still hear his voice that night. "This is our foundation." I never imagined our daughter would try to chip away at it. I pressed my palm flat against the cabinet where the deed still rested, the envelope thick with 30 years of history. My name, in ink that had outlasted decades. The house wasn't just a building, it was proof of my life's work. Proof that I wasn't invisible, no matter how they tried to make me vanish. And in that moment, my sorrow began to harden into resolve. Christmas arrived with a bitter edge that year. The house glowed with colored lights strung along the porch, yet inside the warmth felt hollow. I roasted a small chicken instead of a turkey, telling myself simplicity would soothe the tension. But as family gathered, the air brimmed with unspoken words. Dinner began quietly, silverware clinking, the scent of sage and roasted vegetables heavy in the air. I sat at the far end of the table, watching my daughter command the conversation, her laughter pitched a little too high. Brian leaned close to her, whispering, and I caught fragments. Once it's done, finally ours. The words no longer stunned me. They confirmed what I already knew. I lowered my gaze to my plate, then lifted it again, catching my own reflection in the window. The woman staring back was lined, weary, shoulders slightly stooped from years of carrying too much. But beneath the fatigue, I saw something sharper. For years, my quiet was treated as surrender. That night, it became my disguise. For so long, I had mistaken silence for weakness. Every time I swallowed hurt to keep peace, I thought I was losing ground. But now, I saw it differently. Silence had given me time. Time to listen, time to gather proof, time to hold my cards until the moment was right. I thought back to the notary's seal on the deed, the heavy stamp that had marked my name into permanence. To Brian, it was just paper waiting to be rewritten. To me, it was armor. As the chatter swelled, I forced a smile, nodding at jokes I barely heard. Let them believe I was fading, retreating further into the background. Let them mistake my quiet for surrender. Inside, my resolve thickened like steel. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the house hushed, I stood at the window with a mug of tea, steam curling into the cold air. Outside, snow dusted the ground, softening the sharp edges of the world. I whispered to myself, not as a question, but as a promise. I am not being erased. I am the one who decides who is invited back. The house creaked around me, steady and solid. It reminded me of all the times I'd repaired it with my own hands, patched leaks, painted walls, kept it standing when everything else threatened to fall. And I understood then that the deed wasn't just proof of ownership, it was proof of survival. My silence had shifted. No longer a shield to hide behind, it had become strategy, waiting for the moment when revealing the truth would cut deepest, not just for me, but for everyone who needed to see it. January settled in with sharp winds and icy mornings. The beach lay quiet under a sheet of frost, gulls circling overhead with cries that echoed loneliness. Inside the house, silence stretched long between visits, broken only when my daughter and Brian dropped by, their voices pitched with forced cheer. One Sunday afternoon, Brian arrived with a box of pastries. He set them on the counter, his smile too smooth. "Thought we'd brighten your day," he said. My daughter chimed in quickly. "We want to help more, Mom. Maybe we can take over bills. It'll be easier for you." I smiled faintly, nodding as though grateful. But their words pressed like cold hands around my throat. Help was just another word for control. At church later that week, Mrs. Campbell leaned close as we shuffled hymnals. Her breath smelled faintly of peppermint. "Be careful," she whispered. "I heard your son-in-law boasting at the cafe. He said by next Thanksgiving, the house would be theirs." I forced a polite smile, but my hands trembled as I folded the hymn book. The gossip wasn't idle anymore. It was warning. Days later, Brian cornered me in the study. The air carried the scent of his cologne, sharp and heavy. "We should talk about the deed," he began smoothly. "If you add Sarah's name, it'll protect everyone." "It's really just a formality." I folded my arms, keeping my voice calm. "I'll think about it." His smile widened. "That's all I ask." False reconciliation. He believed he was winning, that my silence meant surrender. My daughter played her part too. Over tea one evening, she reached across the table, her tone gentle. "Mom, we just want what's best for you. You shouldn't have to carry everything alone." I stirred sugar into my cup, the spoon clinking softly. "I appreciate that," I said, and I let her believe her script had landed. Meanwhile, the children revealed more than the adults intended. Lily tugged my sleeve one snowy afternoon, cheeks pink from the cold. "Daddy says we'll have new rooms when the house is ours," she said matter-of-factly, her small hands clutching her mittens. I knelt, brushing snow from her hat. "Sweetheart, rooms don't make a home." Her innocent eyes blinked wide, confused, but she nodded. That evening, I called Mr. Hughes at the bank. His steady voice reassured me again. "Your ownership is clear. No cosigner, no lien. Only your signature matters. If you ever consider selling, we'll support you fully." I thanked him, my hand steady around the receiver. Proof was already mine, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like armor against their whispers. As February crept in, Brian pushed harder. He waved a glossy brochure one night, placing it on the table. "If we refinance now, interest rates will save you thousands. It's the smart move. We'll sign everything together." I nodded slowly, hiding my resolve. "I'll take a look." He left, smiling, convinced my resistance was crumbling. But as I held the brochure under the lamp, the bold letters blurred. It wasn't salvation. It was a trap disguised in ink and numbers. I folded it neatly, tucking it into the drawer where the deed lay. 2 papers side by side, one born of sacrifice, the other of scheming. The contrast steeled me. When relatives visited later that month, I overheard Brian boasting again, laughter spilling from the kitchen. "By summer, this will officially be ours." My daughter giggled softly, not correcting him. Their confidence grew louder, bolder, as if the house already belonged to them. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know silence was no longer weakness. It was a plan. Easter Sunday dawned bright, sunlight spilling across the dining room table I had set the night before. Tulips bloomed in a vase at the center, their petals opening like soft trumpets. Ham roasted in the oven, its sweet glaze mingling with the smell of fresh rolls. I had told myself this gathering might be calmer, less jagged than Thanksgiving or Christmas, but calm was never their intention. Relatives filled the chairs, voices rising in cheerful chatter. Brian strutted from room to room as if he owned each wall. My daughter, Sarah, carried herself with a quiet authority, pouring drinks, directing children, arranging dishes as though she were the host. When everyone was seated, Sarah rose to her feet, her glass lifted. The chandelier light glittered across her earrings, and her smile was the kind reserved for lawyers about to make a closing argument. "Family," she began, her voice ringing clear. "This home has always been special." But times change. Starting this year, Brian and I will be hosting holidays here. Mom has done enough. It's time we take over. Applause broke awkwardly across the table. Some relatives clapped politely, others exchanged uncertain glances. My hands tightened around my napkin, the fabric twisting under my fingers. I rose slowly. "Is that so?" My voice carried steady despite the hammering of my heart. Sarah's smile faltered. "Yes, it's time, Mom. We've already spoken with people who can help transition things. Everyone agrees it's for the best," Brian chimed in, his grin smug. "You'll still visit, of course. But from now on, it'll be our house." The words echoed, heavy and final. I let the silence hang, the sound of the ticking clock filling the room. Then I reached for the leather folder resting at my side. "There's something you've overlooked," I said calmly. I laid the folder on the table and opened it. The crisp envelope slid free, its seal unbroken. With deliberate care, I unfolded the deed and placed it flat before the candles. "This house," I said, tapping the page, "is not yours. It never was. My name, and only my name, sits on this deed. 30 years of work, sacrifice, and sleepless nights built these walls. Not yours." Mine gasps rippled around the table. A cousin leaned forward, eyes wide. My granddaughter's fork clattered to her plate. Sarah's face blanched, then flushed crimson. "That can't be," she stammered, reaching for the page. I slid it closer to me, my voice sharp. "Don't touch it." Look closely. Whose name do you see?" Her lips trembled as she read aloud, barely above a whisper, "Margaret Carter." Her fingers traced the letters slowly, her lips moving without sound. For the first time, shame softened her voice. "Exactly." My tone cut like glass. "Not Sarah, not Brian. Margaret Carter." Brian scoffed, trying to recover. "This doesn't change anything. We can still... It changes everything," I interrupted. My eyes locked onto his. "Because while you whispered about removing me, while you plotted and lied, this deed stood as truth. And the truth is, you have no claim here." Murmurs spread through the room, relatives whispering, eyes darting between us. My daughter's voice cracked. "Mom, why are you doing this? You're embarrassing us." I held her gaze, my heart breaking even as resolve anchored me. "No, Sarah. You embarrassed yourself the night you told me I wasn't invited back. Tonight, you learn what it means to be dismissed." Brian slammed his fist against the table, rattling dishes. "You can't humiliate us like this." "I already have," I said evenly. The tulips trembled in their vase, petals falling to the tablecloth. My granddaughter whispered to her cousin, "Grandma's name is on it," her small voice carrying louder than she intended. The silence that followed was heavy, final. I gathered the deed back into its envelope, sliding it into the folder. My voice softened, but it carried through the room. Family is built on respect. Without it, walls are just wood and stone. If you can't respect me in this house, you don't deserve to sit at this table. No one clapped this time. No one laughed. They only watched as the balance of power shifted before their eyes. The house was quieter after Easter, but the silence was different. Thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of that confrontation. Sarah and Brian didn't come by in the days that followed. Instead, their absence echoed louder than their presence ever had. Word of what happened traveled quickly. By the following Sunday, whispers curled through the church pews like smoke. Mrs. Campbell caught my hand at the door, her eyes gleaming with restrained satisfaction. "Everyone's talking," she said softly. "They know now whose name is written where it matters." I nodded, my throat tight. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was something closer to relief, tempered by grief. "At the bank, mister." Hughes called me into his office, the smell of leather and peppermint candies grounding me once more. "I heard about Easter," he said carefully. "It must have been difficult. But you did the right thing. That deed is unshakable. And if you ever wish to make arrangements, we'll ensure your wishes, not anyone else's, are followed." He spread forms across his desk, explaining options, retaining full ownership, placing the property in trust, or even establishing a legacy fund. The papers rustled under his hands, and I realized the future of this house was still entirely in mine. As I signed, I realized this wasn't paperwork. It was a promise that my sacrifices would outlast my pain. At home, my granddaughter Lily approached me hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grandma, Mommy said you embarrassed her, but I told my cousin it's your name on the paper. I wasn't wrong, was I?" I knelt, hugging her tightly. "No, sweetheart, you were right. This house is mine. But more than that, what's ours is love." Don't forget that her small arms tightened around my neck, and in that embrace I felt the first stitch of healing. Meanwhile, Brian's voice carried elsewhere. A cousin told me later, shaking his head, he was ranting at the barbecue, said you ruined their future. But everyone corrected him, said he had no right to claim what isn't his. His bluster had turned to humiliation, his allies dwindling with each retelling. Sarah, however, lingered in the space between anger and shame. One evening she came by alone, her steps hesitant on the porch. She didn't knock at first, just stood there staring at the door. When she finally entered, her voice cracked. I don't agree with how you handled it, Mom. But I can't deny the deed is yours. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't apology. But it was a start, a crack in the wall she'd built between us. In the weeks that followed, I met again with Mr. Hughes, signing papers to establish a new direction. The property would remain mine, but upon my passing, the proceeds would be placed into a scholarship fund in my husband's name, a legacy not of entitlement, but of opportunity. As I traced my name onto the documents, the ink drying beneath my pen, I felt something shift. At Thanksgiving, my daughter had announced my exile from my own home. At Easter, I reminded her whose name was written in stone. Now, in spring, I turned betrayal into legacy. When the forms were complete, Mr. Hughes offered a small smile. This is more than ownership. This is dignity carried forward. I left the bank with the papers tucked firmly into my bag. The wind lifted my hair, cool and fresh, as if the world itself approved. Spring deepened, and with it the heaviness of winter seemed to lift from the house. The maple tree outside sprouted new leaves, their green trembling in the wind like small flags of renewal. I sat on the porch one morning with a mug of tea, steam curling into the crisp air, and thought about all that had unfolded since Thanksgiving. The humiliation of that night still flickered in my memory, her voice ringing clear across the dinner table. You're not invited back. At the time, it felt like exile. Now, looking back, I saw it for what it truly was, the moment I began reclaiming my place. The deed rested safely in the cabinet inside, tucked beside the new papers establishing the scholarship fund. Sometimes I would trace the envelope with my hand, not out of fear, but as a reminder. That name, written decades ago, was proof that I was not invisible, no matter how loudly others tried to write me out. They tried to lock me out, but I was the one holding the keys all along. One Sunday, after church, Lily ran to me across the lawn, her curls bouncing in the sunlight. She tugged my hand and whispered, "Grandma, remember when Mommy said you weren't invited back? I think you'll always have a place here. You're the reason the house is special." Her words undid me in ways I hadn't expected. What began as an insult had turned into an echo of love, reframed by the innocence of a child. That evening, I wrote in my journal by the lamplight, the room smelling faintly of lilacs from the vase on my desk. "Legacy isn't about walls or deeds," I wrote. "It's about the truth we leave behind, the respect we demand, and the love we protect." I closed the journal and looked out the window. The stars blinked steady against the dark sky, the same stars I once stared at with my husband when we dreamed of this home. His absence still ached, but I felt him near in the strength it took to stand, to refuse erasure, to remind my daughter and myself of who I was. Life rarely ties its ends neatly. Sarah's silence still carried distance. Brian's bitterness still lingered. But I no longer needed resolution from them to feel whole. The deed, the scholarship, the legacy, they were resolution enough. As I sipped the last of my tea, I thought about the question that would never leave me. What would you have done if your own child tried to erase you from your own table? Would you have stayed silent, or let silence become your answer?